About Jefferson. You know how I said Gomez Eanes de Zurara was the world's first racist? Well, Thomas Jefferson might have been the world's first white person to say, I have black friends. I don't know if that's true, but I'm willing to make the bet. He was raised non religious in a house where Native Americans were house guests, and black people, though slaves, were his friends, as far as he could tell. As a young man, he didn't think of them as less or considered slavery much at all. As a matter of fact, Jefferson didn't even really see them as slaves. It wasn't until he was older, when his African friends started telling him about the horrors of slavery, including the terror in his own home, that he realized their lives were more different than he'd ever known. And how could they not be? His father owned the second largest number of enslaved people in Albemarle County, Virginia. And I don't know about you all, but I don't own my friends. As Thomas Jefferson grew up, he studied law to grapple with anti-racist thought. Yes, the slave owner was studying anti-racism. He eventually went on to build his own plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia, putting money over morals, a lesson learned from his father. Slavery wasn't about people. It was about profit, business.
Chapter 8, Jefferson's Notes. I know you already know this, but sometimes it's important to put things in context so they really make sense. Britain had ended slavery, at least in England, but not in the British colonies. America refused to do so. Britain looked at America as dumb. America said, mind your business, Britain. Britain said, you are my business, America. America said, well, we can change that. And in 1776, before anyone could spell WEWANTSLAVERY, Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was a 33-year-old delegate to the Second Continental Congress, sat down to pen the Declaration of Independence. At the beginning of the Declaration, he paraphrased the Virginia Constitution, every state has one, and wrote, all men are created equal. Bears repeating. All men are created equal. Say it with me. All men are created equal. But were slaves seen as men? And what about women? And what did it mean that Jefferson, a man who owned nearly 200 slaves, was writing America's freedom document? Was he talking about an all-encompassing freedom or just America being free from England? While these questions hung in the air, slaves were taking matters into their own hands. They were running away from plantations all over the South by the tens of thousands. They wanted freedom, and guess who was to blame? Wait, first of all, guess who should have been blamed? Slaveholders, obviously. But Thomas Jefferson and other slave owners blamed Britain for inspiring this kind of rebellion. He'd written into the Declaration all the ways Britain was abusing America, even stating that the British, though arguing against slavery, were actually trying to enslave white America. But remember, Jefferson agreed with slavery only as an economic system. I mean, he'd grown up with black friends, for goodness sake. So he also wrote into the Declaration the anti-racist sentiment that slavery was a cruel war against human nature. But that part, and parts like it, were edited out by the other more established delegates. Over the next 5 years, the Americans and the British fought the Revolutionary War. And while British soldiers stormed the shores of Virginia looking for Jefferson, he was hiding out with his family, writing. Imagine that. The man who wrote the document that further fueled the war was hiding. As my mother says, don't throw a stone, then hide your hand. Jefferson was definitely hiding his hand. But he'd show it shortly after, because while hiding from capture, he decided to answer a series of questions in writing from a French diplomat who was basically collecting information about America because America was becoming America. And instead of just answering the questions, Jefferson decided to flex his muscle, to tell his truth. He titled his book of answers Notes on the State of Virginia. In it, He expressed his real thoughts on Black people. Uh-oh. He said they could never assimilate because they were inferior by nature. Uh-oh. He said they felt love more, but pain less. Uh-oh. That they aren't reflective and operate only on instincts. Yikes. That the freedom of slaves would result in the extermination of one of the races, i.e., a race war. Uh-oh. And the answer to the problem of slaves was that they should be sent back to Africa. So much for his Black friends, huh? The ones he'd known to be intelligent blacksmiths, shoemakers, bricklayers, coopers, carpenters, engineers, manufacturers, artisans, musicians, farmers, midwives, physicians, overseers, house managers, cooks, and bi- and trilingual translators. All the workers who made his Virginia plantation and many others almost entirely self-sufficient. Surprise, surprise. On one hand, Jefferson was telling his slaves to work harder, and on the other hand, he was telling abolitionists that there was nothing he wanted more than an end to slavery. And while he was busy playing the good guy, promoting, defending, and ensuring that the French knew America was becoming America, and also having a good old French time, back home there was a convention taking place in Philadelphia to talk about the new Constitution.
This debate, the back and forth of what to do with slaves and free Blacks, was what Thomas Jefferson was stepping into when he became president in 1801. And his response to all the fuss was that he needed to put a policy in place that he thought might actually start the process of ending slavery, ultimately leading to colonization. Wait, but he had slaves. Wait, so did he want to end slavery but not free his own? Wait, was he pro-slavery and anti-slavery? Contradiction could have been his middle name, Thomas Contradiction Jefferson, and that held true in 1807 when, as president, he brought about a new Slave Trade Act. The goal was to stop the import of people from Africa and the Caribbean into America and fine illegal slave traders, yes. Instead, the act turned out to be paper thin and did nothing to stop domestic slavery or the international trade slave. No. Kids were still being snatched from their parents, and slave ships were selling slaves downriver from Virginia to New Orleans, which took just as many days as the trip across the Atlantic. No! And Jefferson, the man who signed this Transatlantic Slave Trade Act, started breeding slaves. No! He and other like-minded slave owners began forcing their men and women slaves to conceive children so that they, the owners, could keep up with all the farming demands of the Deep South. Slaves were being treated like human factories, birthing farming machines, tractors with heartbeats, backhoes that bleed. Contradiction. But by the end of this presidential term, Jefferson had had enough of it all. For real this time, done deal. He was ready to step away from everything, from all the mess and madness of Washington, and return to his home in Virginia, where he could read, write, and think. His notes on the state of Virginia would have been a bestseller if bestsellers were a thing back then, and at this point in his life, he even wanted to be done with the fame it had brought him. He seemed to be grinding a different gear now. At least he was trying to. He apologized for slavery. Pause. He apologized for slavery. Unpause. He'd retired and returned to Monticello so he could run his plantation. Pause. So he could run his plantation? Unpause. He'd expressed remorse for slavery, but still needed slave labor to pay his debts and pay for his luxuries. And on top of that, though he'd grown tired of the anti-slavery fight, which was also pro-slavery for him, he still continued to champion sending Black people back to Africa. He looked at it almost as if he'd be sending Black people home from camp, smarter and stronger and ready to build, like it was benevolent and maybe even forgiving. Thomas Contradiction Jefferson, who grew up with Black friends, hoped it would all come out in the wash and that slavery would ultimately produce more good than evil. Jefferson did not free any of the other enslaved people at Monticello, despite his believing that slavery was morally wrong, cementing once and for all the winner in his struggle between the ethical and the economic. One historian estimated that Jefferson had owned more than 600 slaves over the course of his lifetime. In 1826, he held around 200 people as property, and he was about $100,000 in debt, about $2.5 million today, an amount so staggering that he knew that once he died, everything and everyone would be sold. He had been a segregationist at times, an assimilationist at other times, usually both in the same act, but he never quite made it to be anti-racist. He knew slavery was wrong, but not wrong enough to free his own slaves. He knew as a child that Black people were people, but never fully treated them as such, saw them as friends, but never saw them. He knew the freedom to live was fair, but not the freedom to live in America. The America built on their backs. He knew that all men are created equal. He wrote it, but couldn't rewrite his own racist ideas.